Thanks a lot. So yes, this is the joint project with Konstantin. It is about the optimal policy under dollar pricing. And the motivation actually comes from the large recent literature about the dominant currency paradigm, right? Or as, for example, Gita Gopinath called it the international price system. So it's hard to be fair with this large literature, but I think one can summarize the key ideas, the key stylized facts using the following 3 points. So the first one is that most international prices are set in dollars. So let me quickly show you a map. So this is actually what comes from the paper by Gita, but now the IMF has constructed a much larger data samples, so we have a better coverage nowadays. And so what you can see from this picture is that for most emerging economies, almost all import prices are set in dollars. So DCP stays for the dollar currency pricing, and you can see that for Latin American countries, for many Asian countries, the share of DCP in imports is close to 100%. So what is perhaps even more surprising is that this share is also pretty high for developed countries. So for example, if you look at South Korea, Japan, shares above 50%. So for Japan, for example, it is about 80%. And the same patterns also hold for export prices. So not only prices are set in dollars, but they actually also stick in dollars. And so again, there is a large literature about that. Let me just show you one picture coming from Gopinath, Hockey, and Rigabon. So this shows the pass-through, the effect of exchange rate on the import prices in the US. And this pass-through is estimated separately for prices which are set in dollars in red and the prices which are set in other currencies. And so you can see that on impact, when exchange rate depreciates, the prices stay the same, while the non-dollar prices move one-to-one with the exchange rate. So that's probably not surprising at the horizon of 1 month, but what is surprising that the similar patterns are also true in the medium run and long run. So even after 1 year, after the initial shock, we still see these large differences in the pass-through. And that means the currency choice is potentially consequential. It will affect the relative prices and the equilibrium allocation. And finally, and this is kind of the most recent paper that we have on the subject, the paper by Pierre Gorinches, Gita Gopinath, and co-authors, it shows that there's also asymmetric transmission of shocks across countries. So in particular, because of the dominance of the dollar in international trade, we see that a disproportionately large effect of US monetary policy on foreign prices and quantities. So just to show one picture from that paper, this is the effect of dollar appreciation on the volume of world trade. And so we see that when dollar appreciates, the volume of the global trade goes down, and this is true on impact, and this is also true at the horizon of 1 and 2 years. And this is kind of controlling for the global financial cycle. So all these facts together, they suggest that the dollar currency pricing is important. It has important policy implications, and yet this question remains largely understudied. So even though we now know much more about empirical patterns, we know about the positive effects of dollar currency pricing, relatively little is known about the normative implications of DCP. And so that's exactly the focus of this paper. So we want to understand what is the optimal policy in the world in which most international prices are sticky in dollars. And kind of the first question, the natural starting point for the analysis is the optimal exchange rate policy, namely whether it is optimal for countries to have a free floating exchange rate under DCP. So we know, at least since the famous essay by Milton Friedman, that in the world in which different countries have prices stick in different countries, it is optimal to have a free floating exchange rate. We know that if, let's say, US has prices stick in dollars and Eurozone has prices stick in euro, then these prices can't move in the short run, but we can change the relative prices by moving the nominal exchange rate. And by that, we can change the relative price and as a result, the equilibrium allocation and achieve the optimal allocation in the global economy. So clearly, if all international prices are sticky in the same currency, the monetary policy can no longer change relative prices. And so that raises the question whether the monetary policy needs to be more aggressive or maybe less aggressive relative to this free floating exchange rate benchmark. Right. So in other words, should countries have a very volatile exchange rate, or should they peg their exchange rates to the dollar? The second question, which is also often studied and mentioned in this literature is the optimality of capital controls. We see that many countries in the world do some foreign exchange rate interventions or use some fiscal instruments such as capital controls. And so the question is, if the monetary policy alone is not enough to achieve the first best allocation, is there room for these additional tools? Should countries complement monetary policy with macroprudential tools in particular? Then we also started the question about cooperation. This is the question about whether there are gains from international coordination of monetary policy, both at the global level and also at the local level. So in particular, perhaps the most common form of local cooperation is the currency union, when all countries have the same currency and share the same monetary policy. And finally, kind of going back to the problem of the US, we want to study what is the optimal policy of the Fed, right? So even if the Fed acts on the behalf of the US, even if it maximizes the welfare of the US economy, the question is whether it should be concerned about the negative effects on the global economy. Can these negative spillovers backfire and have negative effects on the US economy? And there's large debate in the literature. For example, Ben Bernanke argued that these spillovers are probably small and negligible, and probably the US should just ignore them. It's not even positive, while, for example, Maury Obstfeld in his talks often mentions that these spillovers are important concern for the US monetary policy. And kind of the ultimate goal, the final step, is to see what are the effects on the welfare. So in particular, we know that US enjoys an exorbitant privilege, as has been documented by Gourinchis and Ray. And so the question is, does the dollar currency pricing contribute to this fact? In other words, are there welfare benefits from the dominance of the country's currency? And in particular, this is important for the future of the international price system. So, for example, does China have incentives to promote its currency in the international trade? So these questions are clearly normative, right? They are about the welfare, about optimal policy, but they also have important positive implications. So in particular, the standard prescription of free floating exchange rates and no capital controls, they are widely violated in the data. We know that most countries actually deviate far away from this benchmark. And so the question is whether we can rationalize the policies that we see in the data by focusing on the dollar currency pricing in the international trade. So how do we address these questions? Well, we use a standard New Keynesian open economy model, which we augment with two key ingredients. So the first one is, of course, the currency of invoicing. So we assume that firms set prices in producer currency, in PCP, in the local market, but they use dollar currency pricing in the foreign markets. So that seems like the natural starting point. Without this ingredient, we won't be able even to talk about the optimal policy under DCP. However, there's also another key ingredient, which is quite consequential for the optimal policy. Namely, we assume that there are foreign intermediates in production. So on the one hand, this seems to be a highly realistic assumption. We know that about 70% of global trade is accounted by intermediate goods. Moreover, even the final goods, before reaching the consumer, they go through the whole chain of wholesalers, retailers, transportation companies. So they usually have a pretty large local distributional margin. And so they, in the end, these originally imported goods look much more like intermediate goods in production. But on the other hand, so why we're especially interested in this ingredient in this model is because it allows us to reproduce the key facts about the exchange rate pass-through that we see in the data. So on the one hand, we see very high pass-through at the border level. We know that prices move almost one-to-one with the exchange rate at the border. But on the other hand, we see much lower pass-through at the retail level. We see that the retailer prices are much more stable in local currency. And so when we combine these two ingredients together, we can reproduce these patterns from the data. And as I already mentioned, it turns out that they are also quite consequential for the optimal policy. So this is really the fundamental things. These are really the key ingredients of the model. In all other terms, we try to be as general as possible. So to show the robustness of our findings, we allow for flexible preferences and production technologies. We can allow for pretty general structure of the asset markets and different nature of nominal rigidities. And our solution is fully nonlinear stochastic optimal policy, so it doesn't really rely on the second order approximations, which are frequently used in this literature. So before discussing the details, let me just briefly summarize the main findings of our paper. So the first and probably the main result, and I would say quite surprising result of this project is that it turns out that the optimal target for the monetary policy looks exactly the same as it is in a closed economy or in an open economy with producer currency pricing. So namely, it is still optimal for monetary authorities to target domestic price inflation, right? So at this level, it looks as if nothing changes really. And that's especially surprising because the allocation is not efficient. So the monetary policy is more constrained. It can't really replicate the flexible price efficient allocation. However, the second best logic doesn't really work here. So somehow the monetary authorities choose the corner solution. They completely give up on the external margin, on achieving efficient terms of trade and optimal foreign demand, and they focus solely on the domestic margin. And I will try to explain this result later on. So what this result doesn't mean is that the monetary policy implementation looks the same as in a closed economy or in a world with symmetric use of currencies. So it turns out that implementation of this policy results in a very different dynamics of the exchange rates. So under realistic assumptions, it turns out that it is optimal for non-US economies to partially peg the exchange rate to the dollar, and that will give rise to something what we call the global monetary cycle. So even if exogenous shocks are completely uncorrelated across countries, all economies in the world will respond to shocks coming from the US, and as a result, there will be a common global component which arises endogenously in our model. So the third result concerns the capital controls, and again, it kind of goes against this second best logic. So we show that even though allocation is not efficient, it can't really be improved using the capital controls. So in contrast to the large literature about pecuniary externalities, about aggregate demand externalities, it turns out that the allocation that is achieved by the optimal monetary policy cannot be improved further by the capital controls. And finally, we show that there is a fundamental conflict of interest between the US and the rest of the world, so which makes the global cooperation highly unlikely. So even though the rest of the world benefits from the global cooperation, the US loses from such cooperation and has little incentives to participate in such coordination. On the other hand, more local forms of coordination, such as currency union, turn out to be beneficial for its members. So it turns out that under additional assumptions, the countries can actually benefit from forming a currency union at the local level. Okay, so that's kind of the quick summary of the results. So let me skip the literature review slide. There are 4 papers which are mostly closely related, which I put in red on the slide, and I'm going to talk about them later on. Okay, so what is the setup? What is the model that we use to study these questions? Well, we built on a classical model by Galli and Monticelli with a continuum of small open economies. So importantly, we assume that all countries symmetric except for the use of the currencies. So to disentangle the role of the dollar from the role of the US in the global economy, we assume that US is also a small open economy, which is completely symmetric in all respects to other countries, except that its currency is the one in which all exporters set their prices. In each country, there are 2 sectors. There are households and there are firms. So the household problem is completely standard. So they have a standard CS preferences over domestic goods and imported goods. There's a home bias in preferences, so they consume more of local goods, and they make standard decisions such as choosing how much of each good to consume, how much labor to supply, and how much to invest in different assets. So they make the risk-sharing decisions across countries. So that part of the model is completely conventional. So the interesting part and less conventional ingredients come from the firm side. So in particular, we assume that there's a constant returns to scale production technology, which combines labor and intermediate goods. And we assume that there is a Rothenberg price adjustment costs which generate nominal rigidities, and firms choose producer currency pricing in the local market, and they use dollar in the export market. So in all foreign markets, they set prices in dollars. So for now, we're taking this currency of invoicing as given, as exogenous, and I will talk later about endogenizing these decisions of firms. So as I already mentioned, we try to be as general and as flexible as possible in all other dimensions, right? So in particular, we can allow for arbitrary regular preferences and technology, we can allow for, which is perhaps surprising for this literature, we can allow for arbitrary structure of the asset markets. So the only thing that matters for us is that monetary policy doesn't have additional motive coming from the asset market. So for example, it doesn't want to inflate away the debt of the country. But as long as the real returns on the assets are exogenous to the monetary policy, the asset markets can be complete. There can be no assets at all. There can be one bond, two bonds, etc. So it really doesn't matter for our results. And we also allow for a rich set of shocks. So there are productivity shocks, there are preference shocks, so households can switch between different goods and also change their consumption and time. And finally, there are financial shocks or wealth shocks in the country's budget constraints. So one way to think about them is the terms of trade shocks. So for example, the changes in the prices of commodities. And finally, we can also extend the model in several directions. So as I said, we use Rothenberg pricing as a benchmark, but nothing precludes us from using Calvo friction, so or even Mendy cost model. So it doesn't really matter where these nominal rigidities are coming from. We can also use Kimball aggregator instead of CES demand, and we can allow for heterogeneous firms. So domestic firms and exporters can have different and different productivity shocks. So this is kind of the model that we use. And what is the benchmark for us? Well, let's suppose that prices are flexible. And it turns out that in this case, the competitive equilibrium is fully efficient. So it turns out that the planner, there are no externalities, there are no sources of inefficiencies. So the planner will choose exactly the same allocation as prevails in this economy under flexible prices. So what is perhaps even more important is that the same allocation can be implemented under sticky prices if prices are sticky in the currency of the producer. So by stabilizing, so if there's only one sticky price per country, then the monetary authorities can take that price as a numeraire and adjust all other flexible prices to replicate the relative prices from the flexible price equilibrium. And that will implement exactly the same allocation. So that's exactly how one can formalize the intuition from Milton Friedman, and that's exactly the result of several papers like Clarida, Galli, Gertler, Galli, Monacelli, etc. So we know that if the use of currencies is symmetric, then the first best allocation can be implemented.
Hi, Dmitry. We have two clarification questions here.
Sure.
First, what does it mean for the asset returns to be exogenous with respect to monetary policy?
Right. Okay. So that's a great question. So I didn't want to spend much time on that, but let me make sure that we are all on the same page. So if the returns are nominal, if let's say there's a nominal bond in local currency, then the monetary policy can endogenously complete the markets. Right? It can make the real returns state contingent by inflating the debt in some states of the world and increasing in other states of the world. So that's a well-known motive for the monetary policy. It has been studied in the previous literature by Diego Pérez, by Charles Engel, by others. They are co-authors. So that's a well-known feature of this economist. And so that's something that we want to abstract from in this setup. So we assume that the monetary policy cannot change the real returns on these assets. So for example, if these are bonds which are denominated in foreign currency, then it's perfectly all right. Right? So in this case, real returns do not depend on the local monetary policy. And so in this case, we can accommodate such structure of asset markets.
But do you allow the monetary policy to change exchange rates? Because that could potentially impact the real return on foreign assets.
Well, as long as it is, so suppose you have bonds which are denominated in dollars, right? Then the monetary policy of Argentina cannot really change the returns in real terms, in terms of dollars, in terms of foreign currency.
But it could change the return in terms of Argentina local goods.
Peso, exactly. But they don't want to do it, right? So if what kind of matters in these models is the return in the foreign currency in real terms.
Got it. My second clarification question is the following. You were saying under the flexible price equilibrium, everything is efficient from the perspective of local or individual economy. But this efficiency is modulo the incomplete markets. Is this the right way to understand?
Exactly right. So that's exactly right. That's only from the local perspective. Of course, from the global perspective, under incomplete markets, we know there will be no no first best allocation, right? It will be not efficient generically. So here it is from the perspective of one individual economy, which takes this structure of asset markets as given.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this clarification. Okay, so let me now go to the main result. So as I said, right, under PCP, you get the first best allocation. Everything is efficient, but as soon as you have domestic prices and export prices sticking in two different currencies, the lower one price is no longer satisfied and the efficient allocation cannot be implemented. And that's exactly the case we want to study. So what is the optimal monetary policy in non-US economies in this case? So surprisingly, we get this, that the policy doesn't really change much relative to the PCP case. It turns out that the optimal non-US policy still stabilizes prices of domestic producers, even though the resulting allocation is no longer efficient. And so I'm going to explain the intuition, but before I do that, let me just make sure that we all understand what this result says. So the first thing to notice is that it is extremely simple policy, right? So despite this complexity of the model, despite this potentially very complicated structure of asset markets, different sources of nominal rigidities, multiple parameters in this model, it turns out that all these details and values of the parameters, they are completely irrelevant as long as we formulate the optimal policy in terms of the optimal target, right? So there's kind of one simple and potentially observable sufficient statistic policy. So what is exactly the statistic? Well, if you take model seriously, if you take it literally, then it is the PPI, right? It is the price of local producers. However, remember that this might include actually the prices of imported goods if they are sticky in local currency, right? So if you would take imported goods, which eventually are sold by the retailers, and the retailers set prices in the local currency, then these goods will be also included in the optimal price index targeted by the monetary policy. So in practice, this optimal target might be closer to CPI than to PPI. So to be more precise, and that's something that we show in the extension of the model, this optimal price index includes all goods which have prices sticky in the local currency. So what matters not where the good was produced, but what currency it is invoiced in. So now going back to the intuition. So why do we get this result? Well, notice that in general, the monetary policy has two objectives, right? So there is domestic margin, domestic demand, and foreign demand. So suppose a country, this economy experiences a positive productivity shock. Then it means that ideally it would like to increase production of this good and sales of this good in the domestic market and also export more of this good abroad. Under PCP, this is achieved by decreasing nominal interest rates, which automatically increase local demand, lead to depreciation of the exchange rate, which makes exported goods cheaper in the currency of destination and then increases foreign demand for them. So here, when monetary policy decreases interest rate, that only increases local demand, but per se it has a very small effect on the export margin. It doesn't automatically decrease the export price in the destination currency, and as a result, it doesn't really boost foreign demand for this good. So the only way for the monetary policy to stimulate exports is kind of indirectly by making exporters decrease their dollar prices. So if monetary policy can change the dollar value of a firm's marginal cost, that will make them decrease their price, and that will increase eventually the exports of the country. So it turns out that in this economy, there is no externality in the following sense. So even if the planner could choose independently monetary policy and the prices, the dollar prices of exported goods, but were subject to the same price adjustment friction, it would choose exactly the same price as firms do. So in other words, even though the export prices are not efficient, they are constraint efficient. There is no externality that exporters do not internalize. And so the planner objective coincides with the objective of individual private firms. And so even though this is kind of the key source of inefficiency in this economy, the planner would set the export price at exactly the same level as private firms do. So does it mean that the policy is inward looking, right? So that's kind of, in terms of targets, the policy looks exactly the same as in a closed economy, for example. So does it mean that the implementation is also similar? The answer was actually yes in the previous literature. So if we look at the previous papers, which studied the optimal policy under DCP, under their parameterization, in their special cases with complete markets, fully sticky prices, log linear preferences, the result was always yes, so that the policy responds only to local shocks. So it turns out that this result holds only in this very, very special knife edge case, while if we look more broadly, if we allow for more general structure of asset markets and more general preferences, it is no longer there. It turns out that the optimum policy is generically outward looking. And in fact, there are two channels for which foreign shocks affect local monetary policy. So let's just, as an example, consider the case when US increases its nominal interest rate, right? So that leads to appreciation of the dollar and depreciation of all other currencies against the dollar. So the first channel is the import channel. So if import prices are stable in dollars and dollar appreciates, that means that all import prices go up in the local currency. And as a result, the price of intermediate goods, imported intermediate goods, become higher, which puts upward pressure on firms' marginal costs. And so without any intervention of the government, the local inflation would go up. And so because the monetary policy wants to stabilize producer prices, it needs to intervene and increase the nominal interest rates. Right? So we see that in response to rise of the US interest rate, all other countries will also tighten their monetary stance. So there's a positive movement in monetary policy across the countries in this case. Then there's also the second export channel. So when dollar appreciates, it means that the export prices in the currency destination go up, which means that these goods become more expensive. And so as a result, the demand for these goods goes down. So countries export less. And as long as there is some convexity in the marginal costs, let's say there is non-linear disutility from labor, that means that the marginal cost of local producers will go down. So as a result, the monetary policy will also intervene to stabilize prices. And so it needs to decrease nominal interest in this case. And so you can see that in this case, we get a negative movement in monetary policy across countries between the US and the rest of the world. And so in principle, there's ambiguity depending on the parameter values. It might be optimal to move the interest rate in a different direction, but generically, there will be some endogenous response to shocks coming from the US. So even if exogenous shocks are completely uncorrelated across countries, because all economies respond in one way or another to the shocks coming from the US, there will be a global monetary cycle. There will be a global component, even though different countries can put negative or positive weights on this global component. And of course, the response will be stronger for countries which have more import or export prices sticky in dollars, right? That's kind of very nicely shown in the data in the paper by Tony Zhang, who finds that the countries which have higher share of dollar currency pricing on the import side, they respond more strongly to the shocks coming from the US. And that's exactly what we get under the optimal policy in our setting. So I told this story kind of starting from this monetary shock in the US, but in principle, the same is true for arbitrary foreign shocks. So for example, there's financial shock or maybe commodity price shock, which moves the exchange rate against the dollar. The optimal response of other countries will look exactly the same. So it will be still optimal for countries to tighten or relax their monetary policy. And so in principle, even unconditionally, we can expect to find correlation between monetary policy in different countries. So for example, if we think about emerging economies, which mostly export commodities, then the export channel will be much weaker for them, right? So they have mostly flexible prices on the export side. So the second channel is not really that relevant for them. On the contrary, they import a lot of intermediate goods which have sticky prices and prices sticky in dollars. And so the import channel, the first channel, will be more relevant for these countries. So in this case, we expect them to move their interest rates in the same direction as the US. And as a result, the volatility of the exchange rate will be lower than without any endogenous reaction of the monetary policy. So in other words, the model predicts that for such countries, there will be a fear of floating, right? And that's actually what we see in the data. So let me just very quickly show you the picture from Izetsky, Reinhardt, and Rogov. So what they find is that more than 70% of countries in the world have at least partial peg to the dollar, right? So, and that's exactly what our model predicts. It doesn't say that you want to have a hard peg. It's not that you fully stabilize the exchange rate, but you partially smooth movements in the exchange rate against the dollar, right? Okay, and finally, I guess for many of you who's who followed more the finance literature, right, there's this debate about trilemma versus dilemma about the global financial cycle, and there's kind of disagreement what exactly we mean by these terms. So let's not get confused by the words here. So what we find is that indeed it's not really the world of Mendelian trilemma, right? The trade-off faced by the policymakers is much worse under DCP than under PCP. The policymakers cannot replicate the efficient flexible price equilibrium here. But on the other hand, it's still not true that you want to have a full hard peg to the dollar. So there are still benefits of having some adjustment in the exchange rates. So in that sense, it is somewhere in between these two worlds of trilemma and dilemma.
Hi, Dmitry. There is a clarification question.
Yes, sure.
Which follows up from what Hannah was asking. So, which is the first question. So we understand if assets are denominated in foreign currencies, then the assumption that the asset prices are exogenous to the monetary policy makes sense. But how does this assumption work once you have foreign currency denominated assets? Does that mean the exchange rates follow what the monetary policy does, but the returns of those foreign assets are the same or follow the same distribution under their local currency terms?
Right. Well, yes, let me make it clear, right? So here, yes, you can allow for any assets which are denominated in foreign currency, but the monetary policy in this case doesn't have any incentives to manipulate the price of the assets, the returns in the local currency. So the planner can't do anything good by changing the returns on these assets in the local currency. So what matters really for the welfare is the returns in the foreign currency. So this motive is completely absent in this model.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we can talk later if that wasn't clear enough. Okay, so now, so I guess one reservation that people might have in mind is that so far we took the currency of invoicing as given, and potentially the model can be subject to Lucas critique, right? So what happens if firms choose currency optimally? Can that invalidate the results that we just discussed? So it turns out that that's not the case. To make firms optimally choose dollar currency pricing, you need some additional ingredients, and this is something that previous literature has found important. So in particular, you need some strong complementarities in price setting, you need complementarities in terms of inputs, but in principle, you can, by having enough heterogeneity, you can make domestic firms set prices in local currency and exporters to set their prices in dollars. So that's what's already there. That's one of the results, for example, in my job market paper. So what is novel here is that doesn't really affect the optimal policy. So that kind of strengthens this result that I talked about before. It turns out that even if the planner can choose both monetary policy and also choose the currency of invoicing, it would choose exactly the same currency and as firms do. Again, there is no externality at the local level, right? There is of course an externality at the global level. The global planner might want to make firms switch from dollar to some other currency, but at the local level, the local planner can't do better than private firms do. So if private firms choose dollar currency pricing, then the planner would also choose the dollar currency pricing. So in that sense, the results are kind of robust to endogenous currency choice. Okay, so now let me switch to macroprudential tools and fiscal tools, right? So this is all I want to say about monetary policy. Now, can we do better with additional tools? Can capital controls help emerging economies insulate themselves from from negative international spillovers? Right, so that's kind of the idea that is in there that policymakers and academic researchers often talk about, and kind of even though there's a large literature about pecuniary externality, the paper which is most close to our setting is the paper by Farr and Wernick in Econometrica, which talks about aggregate demand externality. So formally what they show in that paper, and that is kind of very, very general result, they show that as long as monetary policy cannot achieve the first best allocation, the risk sharing in the economy will be generically inefficient, constrained inefficient, right? So the idea is that if there is some state of the world in which there is underproduction of the good, then we can do better by making households save more and increase their consumption in that state of the world. And that's the effect that they don't really internalize because they take all aggregate conditions as given. So we re-examine this result in our setting. So we allow the planner to choose both monetary policy and also choose capital controls. And surprisingly, we find that this result doesn't really hold here. So it turns out that the local planner, once it implements the optimal monetary policy, doesn't really want to use any capital controls. So the optimal capital controls are just equal 0, and the private risk sharing is constraint efficient. And so I mean, we did some mapping between our results and the results from foreign learning, but let me talk about the economic intuition. So intuitively, the optimal capital controls, they are weighted average of two inefficiencies, right? So there's this tau bar IIT, which shows the deviations from the optimal demand in the local market. And then there's this tau bar star, which shows the deviations from the optimal demand from other countries. So this is how much our exports deviates from the optimal level. And so so as long as there's one wedge in this economy, then the formula shows that the optimal capital controls should be non-zero. So the first wedge is equal 0 because of the optimal monetary policy, right? The optimal monetary policy, by stabilizing local prices, effectively achieves the optimal local demand. So the first wedge will be equal 0 in all states of the world. So what is the source of inefficiency then? Well, it is the foreign demand, the fact that countries export inefficiently high or inefficiently low. And this is what capital controls can't really help with, right? For the small open economy, even if it redistributes some of its wealth to the rest of the world, that will not increase significantly the demand of the rest of the world for its exported goods. And so there is no way that these macroprudential tools can improve the equilibrium allocation. It can affect the local demand, but the local demand is already efficient, and it cannot affect the global foreign demand, which is inefficient in this setting. So this result just shows that kind of knowing the number of instruments and the number of wedges is not really sufficient to make the policy recommendations. It shows that capital controls are not really a panacea against all kinds of international spillovers, right? They can be very efficient against financial spillovers, but they are completely inefficient in terms of fighting these spillovers arising in the goods markets. There's one important caveat here, which I should mention, namely that if there was a global planner, then she would use these capital controls, right? So from the point of view of the global risk sharing, there is aggregate demand externality, and suppose there's a country which has the output below its potential level, well, it can't be because of the local demand, right? Because monetary policy already implements an optimal local demand. It can be only due to low demand from foreign economies. And so what the global planner would do, it would redistribute global demand towards these countries which import inefficient amount of goods, right? So you need to target not the country which has low output, but you need to target the countries which import insufficient amount of foreign goods from the global perspective. Okay, so this is the result about macroprudential policy. We see that just like monetary policy, it cannot achieve the first best. So then the question is, which instruments can achieve the first best allocation? And perhaps not surprisingly, the answer is the state-dependent trade tariffs, right? So this is kind of the most direct instrument which targets the terms of trade. And we show formally that if monetary policy is combined with the state contingent export tax and production subsidy to exporters, then you can indeed replicate the flexible price allocation, right? And there's kind of a nice property here. It turns out that, again, you can formulate the optimal policy in terms of observable, robust targets, right? So you need to stabilize domestic prices, you need to stabilize export prices in producer currency, and you need to stabilize exporters' marginal costs in dollars. But in the end, I think this is kind of more like theoretical result, more theoretical curiosity, while we don't really see state contingent tariffs in practice, right? So it's hard to believe that these instruments can be used to improve the allocation in real world. Okay, so lastly, I guess I have 10 minutes, right? So let me talk about the optimal policy in the US. So here it turns out that the optimal policy of the US cannot be summarized in terms of one simple sufficient statistic. So we need to adopt a completely different approach. So what we do instead, we impose more structure. We assume that asset markets are complete and that prices are fully sticky. And then we derive one equilibrium optimal condition, which summarizes three motives of the US monetary policy. So it turns out that in a more general setup without complete markets and sticky prices, you can still get exactly the same three motives, but then the optimal policy is described by a complicated system of dynamic equations. So it's much harder to see the economic intuition. So what are these free motives? Well, the first one is exactly the same as we had for other countries. The monetary authorities still want to stabilize local demand, so they still want to target domestic prices. The second motive is the standard terms of trade manipulation channel, right? Because all exporters from other countries, when they set their prices in dollars, they have some anticipated monetary policy. Their markups, their prices depend on the expected monetary policy of the US. As a result, the Fed can lower these prices, can achieve better terms of trade for the US. And finally, perhaps the most interesting term in this equation is the dynamics terms of trade manipulation. So this is the term which comes from the paper by Costinot, Lorenzoni, and Wernick. So they show that large economy can manipulate the consumption of foreign countries, and as a result can affect the global stochastic discount factor. And as a result, it can borrow at a lower interest rate and save at a higher interest rate, right? So it can achieve the better terms of trade in this asset markets, better asset prices in the global financial markets. So remember that in our setting, the US is a small economy, so this result doesn't hold directly, but because of the dollar invoicing, the US still has effects on the global consumption and global prices, and as a result, it can affect the global stochastic discount factor. So it can still, because of nominal rigidities, it can determine the international asset prices, and it can again borrow at a better rate than other economies. So that's kind of an interesting interaction between sticky prices and the financial markets. So does it necessarily mean that the US has higher welfare in this economy than other countries? Turns out that's not the case. It turns out that this is the dimension in which a lot depends on the particular values of the parameters, on the particular structure of the asset markets and other additional assumptions. So in principle, US can benefit from DCP, or it can lose relative to other economies. What we were able to show is that if you take a very, very special but frequently used in the literature special case with complete markets, log linear preferences, no intermediate goods, and relatively closed economies, then you can show that indeed US will benefit from the dominance of its currency. But again, I probably need to be kind of more concrete here, right? So what this result says is that in the world with one dominant currency, it is better to be the issuer of that currency rather than any other economy. It doesn't mean that if US could choose between the world with symmetric currencies and one dominant currency, dollar, it would choose the later, right? So in principle, even the US can benefit from moving to the world with more symmetric use of currencies. And it's not obvious that, for example, there are benefits for China from promoting its currency in the international trade. And finally, so far I talked about optimal non-cooperative policy. So let me now talk about the optimal cooperative policy. So the key observation here is that even though US is an infinitely small economy, its monetary policy has global consequences. So what the global planner will do, it will use this monetary instrument to maximize the welfare of other countries and effectively will ignore the welfare of the US, as it is just one point in this interval with continuum of economies. Right? And so what we show is, interestingly, it turns out that the monetary policy of non-US economies doesn't change relative to the non-cooperative case. So just as before, it is still optimal to use their monetary policy to stabilize local demand, local prices. What changes is the monetary policy of the US. Instead of having these complicated free motives, it now stabilizes the global demand for dollarized goods. So if we look at this integral here, what we see is the relative price of good produced in country I in the domestic market and the price of the same good in the foreign markets, which is sticky in dollars. Right? And so this ratio shows the deviation from the low one price. And of course, the global planner ideally would like to set it to 1, right? Would like to set the same price in all economies. However, because the domestic price is sticky in one currency and the export price is sticky in dollars, it can't really achieve, it can't really eliminate these deviations from the low one price across all economies. So what it will do instead, it will use the US monetary policy to stabilize on average these deviations across all countries. So this result immediately implies that there will be a conflict of interest across economies, right? So US gives up on domestic margins to stabilize this global demand for dollarized goods that presumably increases the welfare of other economies, but the US doesn't get anything in return since the policy of other countries doesn't change, right? So they still stabilize their domestic prices. So that means that US unambiguously loses from such coordination and is unlikely to participate in the international cooperation. So there is only one special case, one exception, when the interests of the countries are perfectly aligned, namely when the shocks are perfectly correlated across countries. So if we think, for example, about the global crisis as the one we had in 2008, then it turns out that all countries want to stimulate their economies, all countries depreciate the exchange rates. And so in this case, actually, the non-cooperative solution coincides with the optimal cooperative one. And in this model, without zero lower bound, without any additional frictions, you can actually achieve the first best allocation. Okay, so the fact that the global cooperation is highly unlikely made us think about more local forms of coordination. So for example, can country benefit from forming a currency union such as the Eurozone? And of course, there are some costs, right? We know well that if we have one monetary authority instead of country-specific monetary policy, then there's less flexibility, and so that decreases the welfare of individual economies. And these costs, these losses are proportional to the correlation of shocks across countries. So the less correlated are shocks across countries, the higher are the costs of having one monetary policy instead of country-specific monetary policy. So this is true under PCP. This is equally true in our setting. So what is novel here, however, is that there are also some benefits of having a common currency. So in particular, we find that cooperation can increase the welfare of the economies because it internalizes the demand spillovers on foreign exports, right? So as we just said, that monetary policy always makes domestic demand optimal, but the demand for imported and exported goods is suboptimal. Which means that some form of cooperation can increase the welfare of these economies. And notice that this is true even if we keep the prices, the currency of invoicing, exactly the same as we have in the baseline model with all international prices sticky in dollars. Potentially, there can be additional benefits from promoting the local currency. So for example, if the trade flows within the Eurozone switch to euro from the dollar, then that will also increase the welfare of these economies. Okay, so let me conclude by just quickly summarizing the main results. So we show that despite the inefficient allocation under dollar currency pricing, the optimal policy remains exactly the same in terms of targets. It is still optimal to have inflation targeting. And so one can't really say that because of the dominance of the dollar, countries need to abandon their inflation targeting. At the same time, such policy will give rise to the global monetary cycle. There will be a partial peg to the dollar, and there will be more correlated monetary policy across the countries. The dollar currency pricing can't be really used as a rationale for the use of capital controls. The capital controls are completely useless here. And we show that there are additional motives for the US monetary policy under dollar currency pricing, which partially internalize these international spillovers. At the same time, we show that global cooperation is unlikely and more local forms of cooperation can be beneficial for individual economies. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. I would be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Dmitry. So now we're open for questions. You may raise your hand or submit your questions via Q&A. If you ask, I'll ask you in advance, and then we'll unmute you to ask the questions. Well, so I guess I can begin with the following question. So in terms of cooperation under the big social planner who cares about everyone's welfare versus local optimization where each government or central banker just takes care of their own constituents, I wonder, just in terms of this result, how do you think about the incentive for people to form this planner solution which takes care of the global welfare?
So you mean how they form this global cooperation, how they enforce it?
So I guess actually two questions. One, if we think about movement from the non-coordinated outcome to the coordinated outcome, could you identify any set of countries that are having a loss in terms of Pareto improvements that are preventing to have the coordinated outcome?
Right. Okay, so I think so in the baseline version of the model, we just study the US and kind of symmetric rest of the world, symmetric other countries. And here we find that US is the one which loses from such coordination, right? So all other countries benefit from international coordination and only the US loses. I guess we can relax the assumption that other countries are symmetric and maybe there will be heterogeneous effects. I'm sure there will be heterogeneous effects, but I still guess that for all non-US economies, that will be welfare improving. So I still think that it is the US. US is really the only economy which loses from such policy in this framework.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So the follow-up or the second point is the following. Have you thought about a different coordination scheme in which all the other countries coordinate as if they had a single social planner? Would that equilibrium be something closer to the uncoordinated outcome or the coordinated?
Yeah, that's a good question. No. So in short, no, that's not something that we have studied. That sounds very interesting. I mean, it's probably not super realistic, but I agree with you that it's kind of an interesting question. So so the only kind of strategic interactions that we did study in this setting is whether it matters that US moves first or contemporaneously with other countries, right? So kind of whether it's a Steckelberg leader or they're just playing simultaneous move game. So there it turns out that results don't change at all. So US already kind of, even in the simultaneous move game, because US knows that other countries will target their price indices, they already kind of know the strategic interactions, right? But I agree with you that it would be interesting to consider the case when you have two large players and the second player internalizes the effects of US and to see what is the optimal policy in this case. So for example, when we studied the currency union, right, this case, so it is, we assume that countries, they have non-negatives, they have non-zero spillovers on each other. So there's a positive share of trade between these countries, but we still assume that this currency union represents an infinitely small fraction of global trade. So it still has no effects on the US economy, for example. So that's not here.
Thank you. I do have a separate question, which is more like a clarification question that I didn't ask. So this I guess is something basic. So in this uncoordinated scheme, where countries can use their interest rate targets to gain terms of trade benefits, could you explain like how each country will behave to promote its own terms of trade and how that would behave in an equilibrium? I have more intuition when the policy lever is not the monetary target, but rather the tariffs. That is kind of clear. That is a trade war scenario. So I wonder if you could help me walk through the logic of this terms of trade motive in this uncoordinated scheme.
Right. Okay, so first of all, right, this terms of trade currency war thing is much more muted here relative to the PCP case, right? With PCP, you have the price, the export price, which is sticky in your own currency. And so when you depreciate your exchange rate, that automatically decreases the export price in the currency of destination, right? So that kind of generates the standard expenditure switching. So that's, with DCP, that's no longer the case. So what matters for expenditure switching is the exchange rate between dollar and the currency of destination. When you move the exchange rate of your country, that doesn't really affect directly the prices of exported goods that consumers see in the foreign economy, right? And so in that sense, the currency war motive is much more muted. So that's the first point. So here, and kind of the second thing, that's the main result, right? It is closely related to this observation. So the only way in which the planner can change the price in the currency destination is to change the dollar value of exporters' marginal costs. So if somehow you can depreciate and change it in such way that the exporters' marginal costs will go down in dollars, then these firms will lower their prices in dollars, and as a result, that will lower the prices in the currency of destination. But that's very indirect way, right? And that's exactly, so there's a non-trivial trade-off that might improve the terms of trade, that can make them more efficient, the export price more efficient, but that is also, that also requires paying these adjustment costs, price adjustment costs. And so there's no trivial trade-off that firms face and the planner faces. And because there is no externality, it turns out that the trade-off is exactly the same for private firms as for the planner. And that's why the planner would choose exactly the same prices and private firms do.
Thanks. This is very helpful. I also want to give you and Constantine a chance to respond to Javier Bianchi's question before
Sure.
the talk. Do you want to say something to this question about currency denomination? Bianchi also had a follow-up, which I'll read below. So quote, if I understand correctly, it seems useful to highlight that the results are general to the market structure as long as assets are denominated in foreign currency, end of quote.
Well, again, I mean, that's something that I think we try to be explicit about, but at the same time, it's not, you can allow, for example, for foreign equity, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily the currency of denomination. For example, having local equity might be a problem because monetary policy affects local production, so it affects local dividends, and that doesn't really work well for us. But having the equity of other countries is perfectly fine. Right, and so here the currency of denomination doesn't really matter. What matters is just that the payoffs of these assets are exogenous to the monetary policy. So it's a little bit broader than just saying that that we can have bonds denominated in foreign currency. We can have more general structure of asset markets, but of course there are limitations. I agree.
Thanks. This is helpful. Is there any other question?
Yeah, I guess I can ask you a question. This is Wenxin. So I guess if we think about the monetary policy makers' objective in some emerging markets in particular, if they take into account exchange rates explicitly in addition to price stabilization, how much dynamics would they change if there's like explicit exchange rate objective?
Right. So actively, in some sense, right, our results shows that if you have the right price index, then that should be the only target for the monetary policy. So they, as long as they have this correct, I don't know, CPI corrected price index, they shouldn't put any weight on the exchange rate. So if they put additional weight, I mean, it kind of goes beyond the scope of this paper because we just want to see what is the optimal thing, right? We can't really rationalize this, but maybe one thing that our results suggest is that maybe the CPI or PPI index is just not the right measure of the relevant price index, right? As long as there are some discrepancy between because the CPI might include too many prices. It includes particularly the price of imported goods, which might be denominated in foreign currency, while PPI doesn't include the imported goods which are denominated in the local currency. So both measures are imperfect. And so maybe if we measure in the data what is the price index that they target, it can be, let's say, CPI plus some weight on the nominal exchange rate. So I think in that sense, predictions of the model might be consistent with what we see in the data, right? So in terms of what will be the positive implications, well, I guess if they put some positive weight on the exchange rate, that means that the exchange rate will be more stable. And if they put too much weight on that, it means that the expenditure switching will be not as large as it is under the optimal policy.
Got it. Thanks.
Thanks, Dmitry. Is there any other question?
Jianyang, I think there is a question.
Yes, there's a question from a chat. So I'll read the question, but in the meantime, I'll try to unmute Julian Bengui. So here's the question. In the GM model, despite being atomistic, countries have some market power over the good they export due to imperfect substitution across goods produced in different countries. So why is it that capital controls are not useful to dynamically manipulate terms of trade?
Yeah, no, that's a perfect question. That's a great question. So I mean, again, this is a relatively short presentation, so I didn't have time to show, all small details, but that's exactly something that we kind of wanted to abstract in this sentence, right? So kind of the two key assumptions that underline our result about optimality of the flexible price equilibrium is, as I said, kind of this exogenous structure of the asset markets. And the second one is that that the export prices are efficient. So in other words, the exporters are allowed to set prices with the non-trivial markup. So they set the price with the optimal markup, and they exploit these terms of trade externality in the same way as the planner would, right? And so that kind of eliminates the terms of trade externality and ensures that the export prices are efficient from the local perspective. So if that's not the case, if there is, for some reason, the markups that exporters set are suboptimal, then there will be static terms of trade externality. And then, of course, there is a room for capital controls, right? This is kind of, yeah, one of the extensions also of question of Lorenzoni and Werning and many other papers. So that's definitely true. But it just seems like it is super suboptimal way of fighting the terms of trade externality, right? Using capital controls, dynamic capital controls to fight the static terms of trade, it seems like it's a very inefficient way of exploiting this externality. So a much more direct way of exploiting it would be to use some export tariffs, right, for example. And so that's why we make this assumption. We want to abstract from this motive of the monetary policy.